Hi there, I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast. You know, I think inspiration is like free energy that can be generated when we listen to someone talk about their experiences, insights, and what they have learned about life. And as you know, this podcast is all about audio. Well, my guest today is all about film. Brendan Davis is a film, TV, and music producer working internationally and with a particular interest in China. He has been a producer on films premiering, competing and winning at Sundance, Berlin and other film festivals. In 2013, he produced the first Los Angeles-based season of a Chinese hit TV show, and in 2019, completed a feature documentary called CRAZYHOT about the world of ultra-hot chili peppers. Brendan is also a seasoned podcaster, having co-created a series called How China Works with his friend Ying Li. Brendan and I had a fascinating conversation together about film, culture, and making an impact in the world. Welcome to the podcast, Brendan.
Thank you, Sue. It is very nice to be a guest with you today.
And I know that you were recommended by one of our previous guests, episode 53. I spoke to Ronald Paredes on rediscovering creativity, and he recommended you. How do you know Ronald?
I know Ronald from my years living in China. Ronald also, as you talk about in the interview with him, he's based more in the Nanjing area, and I was in Beijing. But we met through some sort of small world circles via WeChat, the kind of all-in-one social connection app that everyone uses. And we have worked together a lot. We've been on each other's shows. I used to do a bunch of podcasts myself, as you know, and Ronald's a really great guy and super talented. I've been fortunate to hire him a few times for some things that we needed done. And yeah, he's great.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about your connection to and interest in China as we get into the conversation. Today's the first time, though, I've spoken to a film producer. So I want to kick off with learning a little bit more about that, Brendan.
Sure.
And what got you interested in film in the first place?
I love the question, and it made me really think about it when we were chatting prior to recording. And I think what really first sparked me, both film and also music, which were kind of my twin passions really since childhood, is the interesting connection and the way that film and also music in its own way, of course, can communicate and transcend even language, especially with film, of course, with the visual aspect of that and being able to create subjective responses in people, although the finished product on screen is the finished product. But you and I could see the same piece of work and have a different take on it, although we would both understand the basic story the same way. I was a bit of a weird kid and very philosophical, and I'm very introverted. And I think that with film, it was a way for me to connect with greater experiences outside myself, but also have my internal interpretation of it. And I don't know of an art form that is as immersive as film that lets you do that. So I think I was drawn to the idea of communicating across barriers as I interpreted it later. I didn't have that analysis as a kid, of course.
And did you have any favorite movies when you were a youngster?
I sure did. I remember quite a few things from being small, and the first big event film that I remember seeing was Star Wars. I guess I was 11 and I saw the original Star Wars in the theater with all my friends from my Boy Scout troop, and that was wonderful, in a theater full of other people. I also saw something that was wildly inappropriate for a small child. It probably scarred me a little bit, but in later years, I studied it more academically, which was The Exorcist, the William Friedkin horror film. And oh, wow, did that make an impression, you know?
It didn't have really any scary music, and that's sometimes a thing that's really frightening in a film.
And what's interesting about that, that's actually exactly what got me into studying it academically when I was in college. Was I came across a book in the library at, I want to say, the University of Georgia. That would be where I was at the time. And it was all about the sound design of that film as opposed to the score and the music. Now, the music, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, is the classic. Dun, 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 dun. That's that classic theme that's been reworked a lot. But the sound design in that, I could do a 2-hour podcast just on that. So I'll leave it there. But if somebody's interested in the effect that that element of filmmaking has, that's a great place to start because they did some really revolutionary and groundbreaking things that made it so scary. And probably the most impressive part about it, and why I've been able to work in film and music, and my interest in film is as much driven by the use of sound and music in film as it is the visual and the textual part, is that they managed to create these moments that, again, the music was either absent or super, it was underscore, it was very low, or it just wasn't scary per se. And even what you're seeing on screen isn't necessarily scary, but they did things in the sound design that were very subtle. Friedkin and his sound team were very much into using subliminal audio in provoking a response. There would be moments where you're not seeing anything visually horrifying yet, but yet you have this horrible sense of dread and unease. And it's just the way that they approached creating all that. It's pretty cool. If somebody's interested in that, that's a great place to dig into it.
So already I'm getting a sense of your passion and your interest in this genre. I want to get a better sense of understanding in terms of the whole creative process for filmmaking. At what stage does a producer get involved?
Well, the producer or the person who's doing producing functions is really at the inception of it becoming a project and not just, say, a script. And oftentimes also in Hollywood, which I mean as a concept more than a place, although it applies to the place, sometimes a producer will have an idea and then decide to find a writer. If they're not a writer, they will hire somebody or they'll find something similar that exists. And the producer is essentially the person who says, hey, let's make this a thing. Now, a writer director listening to this might take exception, but also if they're a working writer director, they understand what I'm saying because even if that's their only producerial function, the act of saying, let's make this into an actual thing and start to put it together. How do we build a team? How do we budget it? How do we make this a reality? Where does it fit in the marketplace? Those are all producing functions. So, someone like Steven Spielberg, who everyone knows as a director, he's much busier as a producer than he is as a director because if you're directing, you can pretty much direct one thing in a given moment because you can physically be one place at a time. Although he has done two at once, where he had a video set up on set of the terminal while he's directing the terminal. In between takes on that, he's directing like pickups on another movie, some on another location with another crew. But that's its own story. But the producer is the prime mover of it as a, for lack of being less crass about this, as a piece of business. So if a writer director decides that he or she wants to start to make it a reality and they pick up the ball and trying to raise finance or trying to attach some kind of star talent or create talent that helps move it forward as an into reality, those are producing functions.
And in terms of how you got into the producer role from your interest in movies and film, how did that happen? Because I guess, like in any career, people can have an aspiration to perform a certain function, but they don't always find an easy route to get there.
True, and I don't know how much easier it gets, no matter how long you do it, because I mean, of course you learn a lot of things not to do, but you still face some of the same challenges continually. For me, I started in film. I worked on the technical side. I worked as a production sound man, and I also worked as a picture editor a few years after getting some experience under my belt. And I would alternate between those two jobs. But in school, I was drawn to it from writing and directing. So initially, my primary focus was writing, and directing became the natural extension of that because then you're writing the piece that's on screen as opposed to the piece that's just on the page. And producing developed out of that because, as I was saying, the producer is ultimately the person whose responsibility is to take these different pieces and aggregate the talent and the resources you need to make it something that we can all press play on television or Netflix or YouTube or whatever.
And the Oscars is one of the ceremonies that we all have heard of that gives recognition to the film industry. From your perspective, I know you've got a number of accolades in terms of some of the films you've been involved with, Brendan, over the years that have been seen and presented at some of the film festivals. What do you think makes a film award worthy?
I think this is a great question, and it could be any number of things. It could be, is it of such a stunningly high level of originality that it's very fresh and it breaks through with people. It connects in a way where, wow, I've never seen quite that same spin on the ball before. And it's really done at a very high level, technically, artistically, so it can break through in that way. It could also be something that we've seen a million times, and it's not that much of a fresh spin on the ball. But by gosh, we love it. It's something that's a deeply rooted archetypal connection to a classic story that everyone loves, and it's a perfect example of it. Maybe it's not reinventing the wheel. I'm going to use all my cliched metaphors to make the point because that's what we do. We look for ways to find relation. But I think when, especially on the film festival circuit in that world, what people who judge those and what audiences who attend those and buy their ticket and go to festivals to see those films that may never be seen outside of a festival, they're looking for fresh, original voices more often than not. And it's a way to try things that may or may not, or absolutely are not commercial, or maybe they could be, it could show talent for filmmaking in a way that then studios, networks, bigger producers than me who have a deal, say, with a studio and are looking for a really raw commercial talent that's developing. That's a great place to find filmmakers, writers who have the potential to do things that are very commercial, but it's also a place just to do art for art's sake. The most successful films in general have a sense of cohesion internally. It feels like a finished piece of work, right? And we all have this as an audience member where sometimes we'll see something and we absolutely love it. And if you're someone with background in this world, you can put on your teacher hat and sort of talk about why it worked. But I'm no different than any other audience member in terms of does it move me or not? Intellectually, philosophically, emotionally, does it move me when I experience it or not? And then I can dissect it where I could talk about it to fellow film nerds.
You reminded me about the facet that we often think our head is ruling our decision making, where actually it's our heart, and then our head eventually has to catch up and give us some logic to that innate gut feel that we have about whether something moves us or not. Which kind of brings me nicely onto this question of inspiration, Brendan. Obviously, our podcast is called Access to Inspiration. I'm wondering what inspires you.
A lot of things inspire me. I think that overcoming long odds is something that's very relatable to people in general. I think that that especially moves me. As a business, this is not an easy business to get into. It's not easy to get started because you can make something with your iPhone or whatnot these days. But in terms of really having an impact and breaking through and becoming recognized, even to a small degree, the access to that opportunity has never been greater. But at the same time, there's so much content, there's so much noise that it's hard to find the signal. So for me, what's inspiring are things that I haven't seen before, which, of course, in this day and age, there are fewer of those since we're all so darn sophisticated thanks to the internet. We all seem to know so much more. The general base of knowledge is so much higher than when we were kids. But I'm really inspired when I see something that makes me think about something or feel in a way that I had not before, that challenges assumptions in a way that actually lands and connects with me, even if it doesn't, say, change the way I think or feel about a given topic. It adds that layer of perspective, it adds that nuance of what that other person's experience is. I really love film and TV. I'll just say film generically for the moving image. God, that sounds pretentious, but I mean, that's, any kind of visual representation like that, if it's transformative, and it doesn't have to take me to another place and transport me into another realm, outer space, or something deeply philosophical. Although I love that. I mean, I'm the guy for those films as well. The rise of Christopher Nolan as a mainstream blockbuster commercial filmmaker who's still doing mostly original works, often written with his wife and or his brother Jonah. It's amazing. You think of a film like Inception or Tenet, which criminally underrated, is extremely philosophical film while also having tons of action and a bunch of movie stars and amazing locations. There's a lot of eye candy. There's a lot there for anyone to enjoy, but wow, it's a headbender of a concept. And I mean, I was a philosophy major for a couple of years in college until I ended up switching into film. And I was a philosophy and psychology double major, which probably says a lot about me. But it's an extraordinarily philosophical film. And then you think of, wow, Warner Brothers spent this much money to let Christopher Nolan make a philosophical think piece with big movie stars. It's extraordinary. I mean, he's absolutely a modern hero for me because of what he's doing and why he does it. He doesn't just care about checking boxes and tickling the fancy of the audience as they expect. He's all about grappling with big issues and delivering a lot of food for thought within a very palatable presentation. I feel like I probably went a little off the reservation on that answer, but I got all inspired thinking about how much I love his work, and there are a lot of people I could go on about in a similar way, probably.
Well, I think you're reminding me of that sense of emotion and how something can inspire us when it really catches us in the heart. You mentioned in what you said there, Brendan, the word culture, which takes us a nice segue into thinking about China, because I know you've done a lot of work in relation to China. Tell us about what makes China of interest to you as a country, as a culture.
I think I first got interested in China and that region of the world. I can't pin down exactly when it was, but I was fairly young because I read a lot, and we learned so much about Western culture and civilization from the States. And I imagine it's similar in the UK. But I mean, we grow up knowing so much about North America and Western Europe and a little bit about Eastern Europe, but we don't learn that much about Asia. And the fact that it's so removed and of course doesn't even use like a Roman language system with writing, it's symbolic language. And wow, that's fascinating. So I think that's what planted the seed. And over the decades since being a child, I developed a love for travel and have been fortunate at this point to travel a lot. And I was always really interested to immerse myself in that culture and to see what I could learn from experience and engagement. I traveled some other places prior to ever going to China that also were an absolute culture shock. Some places like in North Africa, I've been lucky to travel through Tunisia and be in an environment where I don't speak Arabic and I'm learning French now. My French is very bad, so don't test me. They do speak some French there. My travel companion, he luckily spoke French as well, so we were able to get around a little easier. But in terms of China specifically, I would say that given that as a background that's been there for a while, there was also the reality that the rise of China Hollywood being interconnected as a goal and a reality, that was really sort of in the late aughts and the early 2000s, and it continued into the 2010s and teens. And I wasn't exactly a bandwagon jumper. I think the people who were trying to jump on that bandwagon started 3, 4 years after me. So I was kind of late stage of the middle of the pack for the people. Between projects, I found myself teaching MFA program in Los Angeles, teaching in the producing and filmmaking program specifically, and very international school. And a lot of the students, they're from all over the world, but roughly 20, 25% of a given class would be from China. So I also got to know a lot of Chinese people, a lot of young Chinese people who were working on a graduate degree in film very specifically. And that's a very narrow slice of the whole population. But I got to learn about their perspectives and their stories with the ones who I would engage with deeper if I was an advisor or just watching their films. So I became more and more fascinated. And along the way, I became partners with a Chinese producer, and she and I developed several projects. And in 2013, I made my first trip over there. But before that, I had helped a former Chinese student connected to some executive producers in China who were friends. One of them was a mentor of his. And I helped them develop an idea that ended up being the first US season of a big Chinese hit TV show that I produced with my partners and team in Los Angeles. And so we did that in early 2013 through the summer. And that was very successful and quite a learning experience. But after that, I went to China for the first time with my Chinese partner who was based in LA also and started meeting people. And because of the connections that she had and connections I developed, we were able to meet a lot of people who are really at the top of the industry on the business side and the governmental side. So I never had the experience of someone who, say, decided they want to go teach English in China when they're 20 years old. That's not my experience. I mean, I went as a grown person trying to do some business. So it was fascinating. And again, I've done probably 300 podcast episodes when I was doing that myself that in various ways touch on what I learned about the business and the culture of that.
From your perspective in film, I'm thinking about how you almost compare the two different cultures. How does the Chinese community view the Western world and vice versa?
That was my stock in trade for the most part because all the business I was doing over there was in attempting to develop co-production projects or to unite the business and the cultural aspects of their industry with our industry, which I won't say that it was a fool's errand because there have been some people who've had a lot of success in that. I had moderate success in that, but the world has changed a lot. So that is its own follow-up to this, I would say. But in terms of the primary differences, well, you have to start with the high level, generic, really cliched answer that everyone understands, which is the differences between a collective culture versus an individualistic culture, and then go from there. That is the right starting point, though, I think. And I created a podcast that I've since retired called How China Works with a Chinese partner who is a cross cultural communication specialist. And she and I spent a lot of time talking with business leaders, cultural leaders from all over the world who somehow deal with China and the other, whether it's the US or the UK or Australia. What I found from having the Chinese students in LA, especially, was that the kinds of stories they were interested in telling were often different than their counterparts from a Western culture. There tended to be less of a sense of exploring who am I out in the world on my own versus how can I make something happen for my family or for this other group I care about. And I think that that orientation, I see it remotely from being online because I left in late January 2020 because of COVID, unfortunately. So I feel like it's probably changing a bit. There has been a big pushback in China against the oppressive work hours, especially in the tech industry, the 996 culture of working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week as a standard. There's been a pushback against that. There's been controversy that has been exemplified in the laying flat movement in China, which is the idea of basically, I'm going to lay down, I'm not going to subject myself into this intense live to work mentality, which being still a developing country in many ways, there's a massive emphasis on you must work harder than anybody, longer than anybody, and you must achieve as much as possible almost to justify your existence. And this newer generation, and I'll say kids not pejoratively because they're the younger generation, although there are people probably up to my age who feel this way. They don't really have the luxury of laying flat, but that's actually a term that's blocked on Chinese social media in Chinese and English, which is essentially like, I choose to disengage from the rat race. And so there's been this reexamination just in the last few years. And I think this is part of the global response to COVID and the restrictions and quarantine. It gave people a lot of time to think. We've seen a lot of people lose their minds with a little too much time on their hands in various places. And that's his own podcast. But I think your original question, if I could sort of circle back to wrap my answer up on that, is that I feel like the interest in how can I benefit my family, my society, my cohort, I think that's a generic difference between the Chinese culture versus especially the American culture. But I do think it's changing.
Well, certainly we've seen a lot of people re-examine what work means to them in the Western world, and as a result, leaving their jobs and moving to something that's more meaningful for them. It strikes me, Brendan, listening to you speak, that you're a pretty deep thinker and being a great observer. Observing what you've learned about China, about the Western world, about filmmaking, and having a chance and an opportunity to think and reflect. Where does that leave you and what your contribution is to the world?
I love the question and thank you for the compliments and insights, I would say. I feel like I don't have a choice except to be thoughtful, especially in my business, but just for my own sense of self in life. And, I think that what we're seeing now in so many ways around the world, we're seeing the wheels come off of so many preconceptions and expectations people had for how things are going to go. The status quo is being blown up or revealed to have issues, to say it fairly generically, in so many ways. And the pressures, as I was saying about the pandemic, have exacerbated tensions. And so, in terms of how I process all this, it's my ongoing in my own meditation time and before I go to bed, it's absolutely what's on my mind because I'm in the middle of several projects right now. One has been delayed and was kneecapped, to use that expression, because of the pandemic. And we've managed to keep it together and reconfigure it multiple times. And we're pending launching that any moment. But it's also why I'm talking to you from California as opposed to Paris right now, that we talked about offline about this setting this recording date and time. So I feel like for me, it's, why am I doing this? Why am I continuing to torture myself sometimes with this career? Well, I've been in this business either technically or creatively or in an executive or managerial sort of role. I've been doing this for, 30 odd years. So I like to say I'm old, but I'm trainable. But at this point, I'm old enough that I don't think I can really do much else. I could do this or I could teach it or talk about it. That's my skill set, basically. But I have a lot of hope and faith and confidence in filmmaking to transcend some of these silos that people find themselves in. And I feel like that's what is going to be even more necessary than ever before as we move forward and as we try the reckoning and reconciliation or whatever the process that has to happen specifically here in America. I mean, we're nowhere near there yet. There's still a lot more. I think there are a lot more people who have a lot more steam that they had to let off. There are a lot of people that still need to figure out how they fit in the world and what they think that even means to be part of a collective. I think all that's gotten exploded, and it started pre-pandemic, of course, with our political situation. So for me, I feel like film as a transcendent medium that can cross barriers and cultures and even language. Squid Game is one of the most popular shows. As bleak and dystopian as it is, it's something that travels across, despite the language. People will read subtitles to follow something that they're interested in that speaks to them. So for me, that is what motivates me to continue to develop and create work that hopefully achieves those lofty goals. The Paris project that I alluded to, it's a classic underdog story, and that's the element that's the most appealing to me. It has a lot of shiny, flashier elements that will make it, it's meant to be a movie, a commercial movie in theaters. And it's set in the world of Paris fashion, and the music and everything about it should be exciting and engaging to audiences. But to me, what interests me about it in the first place is that it's fundamentally this underdog fish out of water story about someone from a different culture going there and trying to pursue her dream, and against the longest of long odds. And, spoiler alert, she's able to do it, but it's not a Disney fairy tale of a process. I mean, she has some real scars along the way of achieving her goal. You see how she actually has to apply the work. It's not just hand of God making everything okay. In the end, it's actually her initiative, catching the right breaks, but applied effort. And I think that that is something that I relate to the most because I didn't grow up with any connection to this business. And the arts entertainment in general tends to attract people who feel like they need to build themselves on their own or find their own community, create a world where they actually can fit. And I relate to that. I relate to that really strongly. And so I hope that things that I work on from here on out, whether it's a fictional piece like that or whether it's a documentary, which is my other passion for filmmaking, I'm really about one half narrative, one half documentary in terms of my development and my interest and orientation. I want things to be connective and thought provoking and at least serve as some kind of a reference point that people can engage in a dialogue and not be so divisive if possible. Again, lofty goals I think, are the only ones worth having.
I think how you've described what's important to you there, Brendan, about connectedness, helping people who have got a desire to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, so to speak, to overcome low expectations, the limited odds, whatever it might be, and make things happen. And to do that in a way where they're working with people, perhaps rather than against people. It is very similar to the ethos of this podcast. And I think the story you've told us today in the conversation really illustrates your sense of values and important about these kind of bigger goals. I found it fascinating, and I'm sure we could go on much longer, apart from the aim that we always have within this podcast is to try and keep it to around 30 minutes or so for our listener. So, as we close, my final completely random question to you is, if there was a film made about you, who would be in the starring role? Who would be Brendan?
That is a wonderful and terrifying question to contemplate. Huh. Wow. You threw me a curveball here. I love it though. Yeah, I have something that I developed that's a TV show that I'm going to rework because post pandemic reality, it needs some updates and it's caused me to re-examine some of the things I was on about when I was in the original. But the central character, he's got a lot of my issues, basically. And so it's a way for me to explore those things. So I would say, I don't know of an actor to say who it would be, but, hopefully somebody handsome and charismatic, as I would hope to be, reality be damned. But someone who is struggling against long odds, but overcoming them and maintaining a sense of humanity and grace under pressure, which I can't say I always do that, but I can say that's the goal. And again, this business will remind you to be humble if lest you forget very quickly. So I think something about someone who's chasing an ambitious pursuit and overcoming. I think that's what I relate to the most in terms of storytelling. And so I think that's what I would like to see if someone were to do a story about me. As long as he actually wins in the end and he doesn't hurt a lot of people along the way, that would be my goal.
Fantastic, Brendan. It's been fantastic to speak to you today. We can put a link on the show notes to some of those podcast series that you've done in the past. I'm sure our listener might want to find out more about those.
That's a great point. I would say that if someone's interested in the China/US/the world, the How China Works podcast.com would probably be the best link. And that's the show that I did with my friend Ying Li. And that one, we get into the weeds of every kind of issue related to those questions. And also my personal website, which is sort of a bio site, but other things are linked from it, is crazyinagoodway.com, because my philosophy is that you need to be a little bit crazy to survive in this world, but hopefully it's in a good way.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Brendan. It's been brilliant to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Sue. This was a treat.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Brendan. He's such a fascinating person, and I look forward to keeping track of how he progresses with his latest film venture, My Favourite Season. You'll find transcriptions for this and all our other podcast episodes on the website accesstoinspiration.org. Remember, you can sign up for our newsletter to keep track of upcoming episodes by going to the foot of the homepage on the website, or reach out to us on social media and let us know what you think of the podcast. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just search for Access to Inspiration. Next time, I will be talking to Jennifer Wild and Dan McClure on the subject of system innovation and how to disrupt traditional problem-solving approaches. I hope you will join me then.